다 되니야 많은 거 야르책 다니마 주버디 자리도
Today is the 6th day of the Ngok summer teachings. I would like to offer my greetings to all the masters, the spiritual friends and teachers, the members of the monastic Sangha, and all my Dharma friends who are listening over the internet. I would like to offer you auspicious Tashidele. Today is Independence Day in India. So Buddhism is connected with Indian history. The place where Buddhism originated and developed was in India. And much of our Tibetan culture is connected to Indian culture. And even when we think about our Tibetan or Bota language, the language of curse first existed in Tibet, but the Tibetan alphabet was developed using old Indian sources as models. The snowland of Tibet, as well as the Tibetan language and culture, have a strong connection with India and Indian culture. So for that reason, today on the Independence Day in India, I would like to offer an auspicious greeting to all of my friends in India. Now, as I was speaking the other day, I was giving an explanation, but I gave one that was a little bit wrong. I said that the tree Nyagroda, or the Nyagroda tree, is a Bodhi tree. And the reason I made that mistake is that is said in the Chinese sources, and that is all I saw, and I didn't realize that during the time that, and when you talk about a Nyagroda shin, or a Nyagroda tree, or a tree that is as wide as it is tall, and they're talking about a Nyagroda or banyan tree that is the same in height as it is in width. And so the Nyagroda or banyan tree is not the Bodhi tree. And so now, in order to explain it to you, I thought I'd give you show you a picture of a banyan or Nyagroda tree. So a banyan tree is very plentiful, common in India. And throughout Southeast Asia, there are many banyan trees. So in English, it's called a banyan tree. And it is in Chinese, it's called a mangjala rung or rung shu. It is a type of those. And so you can see these trees all over. They're in India, they're in Southeast Asia. And so that is a banyan tree. And so the shape is kind of like the shape of an umbrella. And so this banyan tree is not the Bodhi tree. And the Bodhi tree is a different type of tree. And so to continue with the discussion we were having before, Now, as I mentioned the other day, before he became a student of the Buddha, Mahakashapa was known by the name Pipali, according to some sources, or to translate the Tibetan more literally, the born from a banyan tree, or the banyan born. And so this Buddha Pipali, or a banyan born, his father wanted Pipali to get married, and so but Pipali had no real desire to get married. But since it was his parents' wish, he was really unable to refuse his parents' wishes. And so he made a statue of a woman out of gold from the river Jambu, or a type of gold. And he said, if you can find a woman as beautiful as this, with a complexion the color of gold, then I will get married to her. And so since his father wanted him to get married, his father had no other choice but to do this. And he sent his students in all of her dictions carrying statues of women and that made of gold. And as his students traveled through all the different directions, and most people, for most of the students, they weren't able to accomplish what they wished, and they returned home. And the only ones that there was any hope left for the ones who had traveled to the West, because they're the only ones to have hope for, because they had still not yet returned. And so if you wonder, did they find such a beautiful woman or not? I will continue with the story from here. So the ones had gone to the West, and they went to many towns and villages, and they eventually came to the town of Kapila. So they arrived in Kapila town. There was a householder named Kapila who was also named Kapila. He was a Brahmin, and he was also extremely rich. And he also had a very beautiful daughter. And since he had such a beautiful daughter, in the tradition in central India in ancient times, if you had a beautiful daughter, the tradition was to name her Bhadra, which means beautiful. So because her complexion was beautiful, she was named Bhadra. And so this girl was also named Bhadra. His father's name was Kapila, so everyone called her Kapila's daughter Bhadra. And so that is what she was called. Now the students of Pipali's father had arrived in this town of Kapila, and when they got there, what they were bringing with them was the golden statue of the woman. And they'd given a name. They gave a name to the statue because they had to make an announcement. When you're giving an announcement, you have to give an attachment. So what they called her was the goddess of women, saying it's the goddess of all females or all women. This is the name they'd given. In the Chinese translation, they called her the golden goddess. So the names are explained differently in the two. In any case, they're carrying this goddess with them, and they'd gone to the West. Once they got there, and they finally came to Kapila town, what they did was they put the statue in the center of the market. They lit incense around it. They arranged flowers around it. And then they started playing different sorts of music as offerings, and then announced in a very loud voice, "Ladies, if you come and make offerings and worship this goddess of women statue, if you do, then you're going to fulfill 5 of your prayers or hopes." And what these 5 hopes are, the first is that you can be born in a high caste. So those of you who are now in a low caste will in the future be able to be reborn in a high caste. The second is that you will be able to be married into a high caste. And the third is that once you've got married, your husband won't treat you badly. Your husband will not view you with contempt. And the fourth is that you will have sons. And the fifth is that the husband will listen to what you say, and he'll accept everything that you say. And they said, you have these 5 prayers you have to accomplish. And they announced this with a loud voice. And at that time, you could say that probably would be okay to say all the women from Kapila came to the statue and started making offerings and praying to the statue of the goddess of women. Now, Kapila Bhadra's mother, now in Tibetan translation, it says Kapila Bhadra's mother. In Chinese translation, it says mother. In the Tibetan translation, it says father. It says it doesn't really matter whether it was her father or her mother. Her parents heard that this really important goddess of women had arrived, and that if you come, then you could gain 5 boons. You'd have 5 different. Your 5 prayers could be answered, they said. And when they heard this, so it was the mother, or immediately her heart started beating, and she says, "Oh, you have to go immediately. And you have to go make offerings to the goddess of women." And what the daughter said was, how's it going to help me if I go to make offerings to this god and other women? And her mother says, "If you pray to her, then you accomplish 5 prayers, or your 5 prayers will be fulfilled," her mother replied. And the Bhadrata says, "Why would I need that? From the beginning, I was born in a high caste. I have no need to be born in a high caste. I've already been born in the high caste, and I'm also really beautiful. So why do I need this?" And no one's come saying that they want to get married, even though I'm so beautiful. Even though I'm so beautiful, no one has come to ask to marry me. So why would I bother to make these prayers? But her mother insisted that you have to go, you must go. Because her really had a strong hope that her daughter would get born at a high caste and have sons. So she really had that hope, and so she insisted. And so in order to appease her, Kapila Bhadra had no choice but to go. So she took flowers and incense and silks and so forth and went to that place where the goddess of women was to make offerings to her. Now, when Kapila Bhadra was going to the statue to make offerings to the statue, there's something that surprised everyone. And that was that the closer Kapila Bhadra came to the statue, the worse the color of the statue. Now, the the statue, of course, in the beginning was cold colored, but Kapilabhadra was really beautiful. And it's like she had also radiated a golden, she glowed with golden color. And so as she got closer to it, then the color of the statue got worse and worse. It got bluer and bluer. And until the end, when she got close to it, it was as if the goddess of woman that was made of gold had like turned into iron. It like had no radiance at all. Now, the way they tell stories about Indian stories, I think they're probably exaggerating a little bit, but he was really beautiful. And because she was so beautiful, when she actually got there, it's like you got this feeling like the glow of the statue is like it wasn't glowing anymore because she was so beautiful. The whole point is that she was incredibly beautiful, and so beautiful that the glow of that bright glow of that salt and statues actually looked like it was turned really dark. This is kind of like a poetic way of saying it. In any case, when she got there, the statue was turned into like the color of gold and like had no color, like it was like turned in the color of iron. And the Brahmin said, "What is this?" And oh, this is a bad omen. We talk about bad omens in India. They think, oh, this is a bad omen, isn't it? And so, what is this bad omen they're saying? What if someone has cast a spell or done something miraculous? And so they went to look at what did this girl come from? Did it come from someone? And then they saw the girl. And they, realizing that the light was coming from the girl, the Brahmin youths asked Bhadra, "Whose daughter are you?" And so Kapilabhadra said, "I'm Kapilabhadra, the daughter of the Brahmin Kapila," she said. And the Brahmin youth said, "Oh, this is a special girl. This is the one we're looking for." And so just as the girl had told them, the Brahmin youths then went to Brahmin Kapila's house. And when they went to Brahmin Kapila's house, they got standing outside the door, and they pretended that they were asking for alms. And they said, "Please give us something. We are asking for alms. Please give us alms." And so they're saying this from outside, and when Brahmzi Kapila heard that there were people asking for alms outside, he told his family to give the Brahmin youths flour and butter, sugar, grapes, and the like. Now, at that time in India, the tradition or the custom was for girls to go and give the alms. And so at that time, Kapilabhadra herself had to take the things that were going to be given to the beggars. And so she went to give the alms to the Brahmin youths, and when she went to give the alms to her, the Brahmin youths wouldn't accept the alms. And when they didn't accept it, when they wouldn't accept it, then a few moments later, Brahmin Kapila came, and he asked the Brahmin youths, "What do you need?" You came asking for alms, and I gave you some food, but you aren't taking that. So what is it that you really want? He asked. And what they said is, "We've come to ask for a girl. We haven't come for food." And so they were just saying it directly. And so because they said they're asking for food, but instead were actually asking for their girl, Kapilabhadra got angry and said, "I'm not going to give you my daughter as alms. I'm not going to give you the girl." And he's basically saying, "You're being too audacious. How can I give you my daughter like that?" And so what the Brahmin youth said is, "We're not asking for your daughter for ourselves," they said. And then Brahmin Kapila said, "What are you saying? I don't understand what you're saying." And so then the Brahmin youths told the Brahmin Kapila about the entire story. They said that in the kingdom of Magadha, which is the area around Bodh Gaya these days, right? So in the ancient times, Magadha was a very large kingdom. And see how there is a tree called the People Town. It's a city. Of course, it's not a city like today, but it's like some sort of town or city. In any case, there is this town called the Banyan Tree or the People Town. And there was a Brahma in a very high caste. Now, these are people, in that time, they were called people in the Mahashala class, Ken. And he said that there is a student Brahmin there whose name is Pipal. He was extremely wealthy. He has a lot of treasure. And how wealthy is he? It's like he even revolves Vaishnava, the god of wealth. So we have the great king Vaishnava. So this is the wealth god. So you can even rival the wealth god Vaishnava, they said. And they said how he had a son named Pipali, and he was a really handsome, very attractive to look at. And he was very skilled in the 6 rites of a Brahmin. He was learned in the Vedas and extremely intelligent in all 18 areas of knowledge. So they just praised him really high, saying, like, he's an incredible boy. And said, he's the one from whom we're asking for your daughter. Now, when Brahma and Kapila said all of this, he said, I've heard about this Brahman's qualities and I've heard about his name before, but we're in the city of Kapila. And now, it could be that this is the region where the Buddha was born. It's like in the area of Nal. I think it must be in that area. So we're in the town of Kapila. And that rich guy, he lives over in Magadha. He lives in the area of Rajgriha. And so we're so very far apart. So it's very difficult for us to make the connection and arrange the marriage. Now, the Brahmin youths are really very smart and skilled at speaking. And they're very convincing. Said, oh, you don't need to worry about it. Because the Brahmin people, as I said before, he's extremely wealthy. It's like he was the richest person in India at that time, right? As I said the other day. And he said, you are also very rich, aren't you? And so we have horses. If you need elephants, we have elephants. If you need horses, we have various animals to ride. And so you can ride one of those and go, right? And you have a lot of servants, right? And so actually, in fact, living far apart is even better. Because since you live far away, because then the connection for the marriage will be strong. Connections between the relatives will be strong. Because if you're close, sometimes you have conflict. But if you live far away, then that's very good. And so the Brahmin years, it said various really nice things, really attractive things in order to convince the Brahmin Kapila. And he said, oh, they must have some reason there. There's a point to what they're saying. And so Kapila then gave them all the things that they needed to bathe. He gave the things they needed to bathe to the Brahmin students, and then they went to all of these places there must have been a pond outside of the town of Kapila. They went there to go bathe. And while they were doing so, the Brahmin Kapila then called all his relatives, and they wanted to discuss with his relatives, should I give the girl to them to get married? And so when they're discussing, then the relatives said, oh, he's a really high caste, he's like in the Mahasala, he's such a caste, he's like a really great person, he's rich and wealthy. And so even if he didn't have any wish for it, we'd actually really have to try to actually get the girl betrothed to him. And so now we don't have to express any hopes to them. They're coming to us and asking for it. So of course you should give the girl as a bride. Because if we can make a connection between with this Brahmin people, then it's going to work out for us. It'll work out for us. It'll work out for them and for the girl too. And so the girls decided to have their daughter betrothed. They dressed her, they bathed her, they dressed her in white, and then they recited auspicious prayers from the Brahmanical tradition. There must be these prayers that you recite in the tradition, right? And they decided to send her to be the bride of the Brahmin's son, Pipali. So there must have been some ritual to do. Of course, there are a lot of rituals that they have to do whenever on any sort of occasion in ancient India, right? So they did some sort of a ritual. And after they'd done the ritual, then the parents then and then the Brahmin used calculated from the most auspicious month and day and stars. And it's like we have this ritual now, or the astrology, right? They did the same thing in India. So what month is the best? What month? What is the best day of day? What are the best stars? And so they calculated all and say, okay, on this particular month and this day and the stars, she should get married. And they decided that she would be married to Pipali on that day. This is like we say in Tibetan. It's kind of like when we're talking about the auspicious coincidences in Tibetan and the two white gods and so forth and all that. So in any case, they decided they established a day for their wedding, and then the Brahmin youths were excited, and they'd had fulfilled all their wishes that they'd harbored in mind, and they were happy and joyful and delighted, and they returned back to People Town. Now, when they're coming back, then people saw them. And when he saw them, looked like they were seemed really happy as they're coming along. He thought they probably did what they wanted to do, and he kind of had this suspicion about that. And when they got to the people, then the boys said he was their teacher, and it's because their teacher said, "Oh, master or teacher," they said, "Master, you should be really pleased. We have now done just as you wished, master. We found this woman, a girl who is like really wonderful, really a superior girl. Before we left, teacher, you gave us a command, and we've gone off to look for a girl. And normally you have to look at the caste and the clan, and you said that we don't need to look at it. You just need to look at whether she's beautiful or not. That's all you have to look at. You don't need to look at the caste or clan. And so you don't have to, because if you're thinking about only the clan, then sometimes you don't find someone who's beautiful or not. Because if you need to find someone who's as beautiful as like a golden colored complexion, then you can't look only at just one caste. And so that for that reason, you said you don't need to consider the caste or the clan. You just have to consider whether she's beautiful or not. And so we've now found a girl who not only is she beautiful, she's from a really good caste, she's from a good clan, she's also really wealthy. This is just like the best of everything. We found an incredible girl. And so they explained all of this to the Brahmin people. Not only that, they explained how they had arranged the wedding for a definite month and day and star and time. And when Brahmin people heard this, he was just totally delighted. And he gave them a lot of gifts, food and snacks and clothing and different types of jewelry. He gave them a lot of different gifts. Now, at this point, there is the Pipali, who's the Brahmin's son, right? He heard a little bit about the situation, and he heard that there was this girl named Kapila Bhadra who had was really beautiful, had a wonderful complexion, and so he started getting a little bit of a doubt. He thought, I better go and see, is this really how it is? I thought I have to go investigate. Now, he had no desire to get married. But when they said there's such a beautiful woman, He started to worry about what it was going to be like in the future. And so he thought to himself, before this happens, I have to go look into this. And he said, I need to go on a little bit of a trip to some other country. No, he couldn't say that he was going to go take a look for the girl. He said, I'm going for a little trip. And when he said, I'm going for a trip, they said, well, we only have you as one son. And so we really have really strong feelings for you. We really love you a lot. So you can go wherever you like, but you have to get back before it's time for your wedding. And so they gave him the permission. And so then Pipali went with some of his other Brahmins to the town of Kapila. And when he got there, to the town of Kapila, this is the place where Kapila Bhadra lived, right? So following the old condition there is like they're the old bowls for alms, right? They took one of these alms bowls and they went asking for alms. They wore kind of tatty old clothes, and they pretended that they were beggars as they went begging. And they're going from one house to the next, and then eventually they got to the door of the Brahmin Kapila's house. And when they got there, as I said the other day, as I said before, when someone came to give alms, then the tradition in the central India was for the women or the girls to go out and give the alms. And so on that day, it was Kapila Bhadra herself who went out to give the meals. And she took the things and she gave them to the Brahmins. And when he saw her, then Pipala thought to himself, the moment Pipala saw this girl, he thought, oh, this must be the girl. No one needed to tell her, but he saw how beautiful she was. She said, that must be her. This must be the girl that they're talking about. And he said, women who are so beautiful as this are really rare. There are very few like her, he thought. And he realized how rare a person she was. And so then he asked Bhadra, he said, for a girl as beautiful as you, there's probably no second girl, no other girl who's as beautiful as you. I don't think there's a second girl as beautiful as you. So since you're so beautiful, it must be really difficult for you to give up, all these beautiful, because when you're really so beautiful, it's hard to give up on the idea of yourself as being beautiful and stuff. When she heard this, Kapila Bhadra listened to this. She thought, the way you're speaking, she's saying, has your own bride died? Now, when Pipali heard this, he said, oh, no. My bride is still alive. And so Bhadra said, if that's the case, then why do you speak about this? And they talk about, being so beautiful, but not being able to give up on it. And so what Pipali said in that is, my bride is still alive. She's still alive, but she's someone who's not really interested in worldly things. She's not interested in desires. And when Bhadra heard this, and she thought, she was surprised to hear this, and she said, oh, that's really amazing. That's actually really good. Actually, I myself don't have any interest in worldly desires either. Now, the reason why he had to speak in this way, Pipali wanted to see whether or not she had worldly desires or not, whether she had the desires of a householder or not. And so when he was asking like this, then Pipali thought to himself, he got really happy. And what he said to her, he felt really happy. And what he said, now, in case I were actually Pipali, he said, I would make a promise to stay with you, to live with you. And because there's no way to go against our parents' which commands and to get married. But other than that, there's no choice but to get married, but I'd otherwise promise not to touch any part of your body with my hands. And so they kind of talked it through, and they came to like a discussion. And then at that point, Pipali, he himself, he only wanted to practice the Dharma. He had no desire to engage in the householder life and worldly things. And Kapilabhadra was also exactly the same. And so they were easily agreed. Their wishes were in accord, and they agreed, and they made the promises to each other. And then Pipali once more returned back to his home in Pipaltown. And when he went back then, on that really auspicious day, then the girl, the Kapila's daughter Bhadra, then came as was brought as the bride. Brahman Pipal took her to Pipaltown. And Pipali's parents prepared a house for them to stay in. And in the house, they had beds, right? And they made 2 beds to put in. They had them sleeping in 2 separate beds. And since there were the 2 beds for them, since they made 2 beds for the couple, they talked to each other and they said, we made this promise to each other, and so don't forget the promise we made. They encouraged each other. And they said, we need to stay together, not like husband and wife, but more like a mother and daughter. And so when they live together as like a mother and daughter, then Pipali's parents are always talking about the servants, saying, how are they doing? Are they getting along? What are they doing? And when they asked them, then the servants, then when they asked the servants, how are they doing? The servants said, they're living together like a mother and a daughter. And Pipali's parents, that's not okay. That's not working out. That's our own mistake. So why did we make 2 different beds for them? They should only have 1 bed. If we had made 1 bed, then they'd have no choice. It would work out as we meant. But right now, all our plans have gone bad. And so they took one out of the bed set. There's only 1 bed. And then there are little chairs. And there was a chair on the other side of it. They left only 1 bed. And so there's only 1 bed left. But Pipali and Bhadra and didn't have any desire for each other. And over and above that, they'd made the promise to each other. So what Pipali said, Bhadra, you're a female, so you need more sleep. So you sleep in the first part of the night in the early morning, and I'll sleep in the middle of the night. So first you go to bed first, and then in the middle of the night, I'm going to lie down, and then after that, then you can go to bed again. And so there's only 1 bed, so basically only 1 person could lay at a time. So the Kapilabhadra slept first, and during that, while she was sleeping, then Pipali either sat in the chair, either thinking, or he would kind of go out and pace back and forth. So that's how they lived together. Now, as they're living together in this fashion, a big snake got into their bedroom and then was coiled up underneath their bed. And Pipali saw it. Pipali saw it and he thought, this snake isn't going to be good. This poisonous snake isn't going to do well. But at that point, Bhadra was asleep. And as she was asleep, and as Bhadra was asleep, he needed to wake her up. And if he was going to wake her up, the only way he could do it is if he touched her. And he said, I can't touch her with his hand. And he was wondering, what should I do? As she was sleeping, one of her arms was hanging over the edge of the bed. And as she was staying like that, then Pipali thought to himself, I can't touch her hand, so what should I do? But if I don't wake her up, the snake is going to bite her. And around there, he saw like a fan. Like, in India, they often have fans to handheld fans that you wave back and forth. And this is like a fan or a fly whisk. This is like a whisk that you wave back and forth to fly away to drive off mosquitoes or to wave away mosquitoes. So he picked it up and it has a handle, right? And he'd hold it by the whisk, and then he would touch. He touched to Bhadra with a handle, not with his hands. When he did, she woke up at the start, and she was afraid, right? And what she thought is, oh, he must have touched me with his hand, she thought. And she said, don't forget your promise. You made a promise before. Don't forget your promise. She didn't know what actually happened. And Pipali said, no, it wasn't like that. He said, there was a poisonous snake under your bed. An incredibly poisonous snake, and if it bit you, so I didn't want it to, so I touched you with the handle of the fan. What Kapila Bhadra said is, that snake's going to bite me, then let it bite me. But it's not okay for you to touch me with a fan. It's not okay to use the fan to touch me. So not only he could not touch her with his hand, he couldn't touch her with the handle of a fan. That's what she said. If you think about it, it's actually a little bit too extreme, isn't it? But in the Bhikshuni Vibhanga, it said, what it says is that there's this poisonous snake that came, right? And so what it says in the Tibetan translation of the Bhikshuni Vibhanga is that the poisonous snake was actually an emanation of Shakra, the god Shakra, who had come to see whether or not there was any lust between the two. He was coming to test them and see if it really was the case. In any case, it was a poisonous snake came, and it's hard to say whose emanation it was. But we have to have like a bit of a doubt about that. Like for ordinary people living together, if you're staying together, you're like regular people. It happens that just people start feeling desire. But they didn't have any desire at all. So why is it that they didn't have any desire? They must have had many reasons, but the main thing is that Pipali himself, in his previous lives, he had been the god Brahma in the form realm. He had been born in Brahma's abode in the first realm of form, because he had been that. He had meditated on jhana, and so he had no actual desire or lust anymore. And so because he had spent a long time, many eons, dwelling in the state of being detached from desire, he'd had habits of this for not just a few years, but probably for many eons. So this is the discussion. But in brief, they had spent 12 years living in one house with only one bed. And even though they spent 12 years living in the house, neither of them ever felt any desire for the other. And so I had to give some of an explanation of this. So that's the story. In any case, after a long time, Pipali's parents both died. They both eventually died. And after his two parents had died, then Pipali kind of was thinking to himself and said before, he said, when my two parents were alive, we didn't have to do anything. Parents did everything. They took all responsibility. Now that both of the parents have to die, we need to take care of the household. And so this is what he was thinking. And then he said to Bhadra, so when my two parents were alive, we just stayed here and enjoyed ourselves doing whatever we wanted. But now they've both died, so we have to take the responsibility for running the household. So you look after the housework, the inside work, and I'll go out and look over the farm work. So then Pipali went out to do the farm work. Now, he didn't actually do the farm work, but he went to oversee the workers. And so when he went out to oversee the workers in the fields, now he'd never overseen the work, and so he went out and he didn't know what he was doing. And he went to the places where the workers were working, and he went there. Now, his father had a lot of land for fields, many fields. And as I said the other day, And he had 909 yoke of oxen and plows, right? The king of Magadha had 1,000. And out of respect for the king of Magadha, he only made 999, even though he had enough wealth to make 1,000 if he wished. In any case, he had 999 yoke of oxen who were plowing, and as they were plowing the fields, they were killing a lot of small insects and other small living beings. There are all sorts of worms and bugs and so forth. And the oxen's noses were pierced. They had like rings in their noses, and they were being beaten with iron rods on their rumps. So they're being beaten. So the oxen were having a very hard time. And the workers on the farm, they got very tired. They had long hair and long beards, and whatever this hair, their hands, their hair was turning white, and their beards were long and gray and grizzled, and their hands and feet were all cracked, and they're covered with mud and dust and so forth. If you look at them from far, you think like burnt out tree trunks or ghosts. They really didn't look like humans. And so you realized what a difficult time they had. When you see them, you have to see it. In addition to these workers, as I just got to, when there are any minor things, like if they're talking about, they'd get into fights, so they'd yell at each other and beat each other about minor things like whose oxen were going to be plowed which field and who's going to do this and the different things. And when Pipali saw this, he didn't really recognize them, and he said to them, "Who are you?" And what they said is that, "We're Brahman Pipali's workers," they replied when he asked. And so Pipali didn't know who his own agricultural workers, because in the old times, he'd never seen them before. When Brahman Pipali said, people said that they're working for me, but I've never sent you to work. And what they said is, that's not so. No, we've been doing this work from the time of your father, who's just continuing doing it. You never said to us that we have to do it, but we've been doing it since the time of your father, and so we're continuing to do this work. And so we started to think about this. People started to think about this. And so if you've been doing this work from the time of my father, it's fine for you to do the work, but you're fighting with each other. And you're about to beat each other up. So what's all this? When you're doing such terrible things, then in the future, isn't there the danger that you'll experience the ripening of the karma, that is to say, that a lot of suffering because of this? So before that, he'd never really seen the difficulties in society and the hardships that poor people experience. But when he actually saw it with his own eyes, they'll only realize what difficulties there are in society, what the hardships that poor people and families had. And so he felt some wish for liberation, and some renunciation. And he thought to himself that he wasn't actually doing any misdeeds with his own body, speech and body, that he was accumulating misdeeds because of them, because they're plowing the fields for his sake. They're killing the insects for his sake. They're treating the oxen for his sake, and they're getting to fights with each other. And he thought to himself, just because I'm indirectly, I'm also accumulating misdeeds. And so he returned to his house, and he said to Kapila Bhadra, I need to leave the house, go to the house, and I have no desire to stay there. I want to go out and just practice asceticism in the forest, he said to her. Now, Kapila Bhadra, while Pipali, similar to Pipali, she was overseeing the housework, as he had asked her to do, and she had a lot of servants under her, and she saw that their hands and feet were cracked, and they had a lot of they had really tangled hair and that they'd, disagree with each other over really minor things and scold each other. And when she saw this, like, this is staying in a house or doing the work, there's no point to doing this, she thought. So she also thought in this way. In any case, they both had this feeling that there was no point. And so then at that point, what they took is all their wealth and they gave. This is before the Buddha had appeared, right? So at that point, they made sizable donations to practice of non-Buddhist dharma and gave to the poor. And then also their servants and workers. They had many workers and servants, and they gave them all gifts and released them from work. And they divided all the rest of their wealth among their relatives. Now, Papili himself, what did he? Went into the storehouse, and we went there. Now, in general, in their storehouse, they had all of the clothes they had were really expensive clothes. They didn't have anything that was any cheap clothes at all. And so he took the least expenses of the various robes, and he made that into an outer robe, a dharma robe, an outer robe. Since if you're going out as a mendicant, he needed to have a dharma robe. And also he made one for Kapilabhadra. And everything else in the house, in the whole house, they gave to his relatives and left. And he just kind of gave away the house, just gave away his household. And then Papili said to Kapilabhadra, so where do you want to go? And Kapilabhadra said, well, I'd like to go with you into the forest and practice austerity to you. And so what Papili said is, if you go out with a woman, like with your own wife, and go to the forest, if I tell people that I have, that doesn't look right. And so if Kapilabhadra said that if that's the case, then before you go, then let me go first. Otherwise, if I stay here, then it's going to be really difficult for me. And then people said, oh, what you're saying is true. So let's go together. So they left the house together. And so they went with each other for a certain distance, for a fair distance. And then they each went in their own separate ways to do the practice. So that's how it is. And then Kapilabhadra, where she went was, this is before the Buddha had appeared, so there are many non-Buddhists, and Kapilabhadra went to a non-Buddhist teacher named Purana, and she went forth with him. But because of her previous karma, she had many difficulties. She had a lot of hardships and difficulties. And she had a very hard time. In the end, she finally came to meet the Buddha. She went forth and became an arhat. There's a really long and very moving story about this, but I haven't got time to tell the whole story now. So I'm not able to tell the story of Kapilabhadra now. So now we will take our 30-minute intermission. So Kashyapa left his home and went to practice Dharma. And so at that time, there were only the non-Buddhists, and so he went to, and so it's not really recorded which of the non-Buddhist teachers he went to see. Now, as far as when it was that that Kashyapa met the Buddha, so generally it's said that Kashyapa was 12 years older than the Buddha. So that is what is said in one source. So Kashyapa had already been born before the Buddha was born. So the Buddha went forth from home to homeless at the age of 29, and then he spent 6 years practicing asceticism. But even though he spent 6 years practicing asceticism, it didn't bring him any benefit at all in terms of realizing the fundamental nature. So he gave up the ascetic practices and then bathed in the Neranjana River. And then there were two girls, daughters of a farmer named Nanda and Nandabala, who offered him milk porridge. And then there was a grasslord named Brahmana, and he gave the Buddha grass that he accepted, and he arranged them beneath a Bodhi tree, and he sat on them, and made the commitment: until I have reached enlightenment, until I've reached Buddhahood, I'm not going to get up, I'm not going to move from the seat. And then he sat in meditation. He displayed the miracle of taming the Maras, then achieved Buddhahood. Now, I don't need to speak about those in detail. Then the Buddha went to Varanasi, and his first students there were the first 5, which we call the good group of 5, as I explained the other day. He turned the wheel of Dharma first for them, or you could say he gave his first teaching. And then there was the next group of 5, so another 5, next 5 students. And then there were 50 people from the city of Varanasi who came and became bhikshus. And then there was the good group of 60. And then following that, it's probably the two who had given him the milk porridge, the Nanda and Nandabala, these 2 girls. He tamed them. And then there was Urabilva Kashapa, the 3 Kashapa brothers. He tamed them. And after that, then the Buddha gained many disciples. And he immediately had over 1,000 members of the Sangha. And then he met the king Bimbisara and his retinue, and Bimbisara and his retinue all became his students. And the king gave him the Bamba Grove, or Venuvana. So he showed these many deeds. And so the Kashyap's meeting of Buddha was a little bit later. It was probably after Shakyamuni and after Shariputra Moggallana had met the Buddha. In any case, it was when the Buddha was in so it was probably And so the Buddha then realized that it was the appropriate time to tame Kashyapa, so he went to the Bahaputraka Stupa in Rajgir. And in order to attract Kashyapa, he needed to summon or attract Kashyapa. And so in order to do this, he displayed a miracle. The miracle he displayed was shining light from his body. And so if you give an example of what it was like these, it's like the Buddha was like a big mountain of gold that was shining light. And he's shown his light in all directions. And Kashyapa saw the light shining, and he wondered what was going on. And so he was really amazed by this, and he began to suspect. And so the Buddha saw this, and he became an investigator. He went to look and see what the Buddha was doing. And he saw the light shining from the Buddha, And then he went to where the Buddha was sitting, and then from a long way away, he saw the Buddha's body. And when he saw the Buddha, he saw that he had all of the different marks and signs. And when he looked from far away, he saw that the Buddha had all the marks and signs. His faculties were like really peaceful and subdued, and it was like this great mountain that was shining with golden light, this really amazing looking mountain. And when he saw all this, then what he immediately thought is that before he had met the Buddha, he had met many different teachers, but today, he said, today I finally really actually met the person my real teacher is. I've met a real arhat today. I've met the real Bhagavan today, he had the feeling. So he had this really strong feeling of this. And so when he realized this, then he bowed his feet to the Buddha's feet. And I said, now you're my teacher. Please be my teacher. Please be the one to guide, if you say. And I'll be one of your disciples. I'll become one of your students. And what the Buddha said to this, I said, and the Buddha said, as you wish, I can be your teacher, just as you'd like. Now, what we normally think is, in our Mula Srivastava tradition, what we say is that Mahakashapa went forth merely by the Buddha accepting him. Other people, there was no particular sense. It's by the Buddha saying, you are my student. So just merely by you accepting that I'm your teacher and so forth, you have gained the vows of going forth. So this is how it's said. In any case, the Buddha said, accepted Kashyapa as a student. And once he did this, then what we say among people in the world is that people, even if they don't know anything, people such as you have faith, even if they don't know anything, pretend that they know, and they say that I'm omniscient. Some people say, even if they're not a Tathagata, they say they are the Tathagatas. There are people who aren't Tathagatas, but they claim that they are. And the people who say this, in the end, the ultimate result is that they're going to break their skulls and break their heads and have a bad result from that. But you don't need to worry about this. That's because I actually know everything that I say, that I'm omniscient. It's not that I don't know everything, but say that I am. I'm not deceiving anyone. Also, it's because I actually am a Tathagata that I assert that I'm a Tathagata. Because I have actually awakened, I can assert I'm the Buddha, so you don't need to worry. And so the Buddha gave more such advice or instruction to Kashyapa. And at that time, the Buddha gave Kashyapa some guidance or some instructions. And the first of these instructions was that no matter what virtuous dharma you hear, what other good or virtuous dharma you hear, you need to listen to it well. Not only should you listen to it, you should respect it. You shouldn't just respect it. You need to concentrate and contemplate it well, and then be able to practice these virtuous dharmas. So that was the first instruction that he gave him. Now, the second instruction he gave him was, and now you've entered the community of the Sangha. And once you've entered the community of the Sangha, when we say the teacher, we mean the Buddha, right? When you're staying with the teacher and your Dharma friends, and what you need to do in your mind is you have to have conscience and the sense of propriety. You have to keep the sense of a good conscience and propriety. Now, the third instruction that he had was, is you must always, at any time, you must have mindfulness and awareness. No matter what you're doing, at any time, you must know what you're doing and not forget the commitments that you've made. You have to have this mindfulness and awareness. And you must not let yourself be careless or distracted. So this is another instruction that he gave, Mahakashapa. So in this way, basically, the Buddha inspired Kashyapa and really increased his interest and faith. And so basically at one time, the Kashyapa was traveling with the Buddha, and along the way, the Buddha was about to sit someplace and take some rest. Now, Kashyapa had his own outer robe, as I mentioned before, one that he'd taken from his home. He said he didn't need the expensive clothes. He took the cheapest of the clothes, the least expensive, and he made an outer robe of it. When you talk about this, it's like these are the robes that the non-Buddhists wore as well. So he had, in order to make himself a monastic robe, he'd taken the least valuable piece of cloth from his storehouse and made it out of that, as I explained before. And for their household, it was the least expensive. But if you ask me the actual value of it, it was like worth 100,000 pieces of gold. But the others were even more expensive than that. So he took the least expensive. In any case, he had this robe made out of really nice fabric, and so he folded up and he spread it out to be the Buddha's seat. And then he asked the Buddha, please sit on this seat. And so this will help me gather the accumulation of merit and will help me for a long time. The Buddha accepted and sat on it. And when he had sat on it, then Kashyapa saw his robe and said, wow, this robe of yours is really soft. It's really nice. Soft, it's like it's very soft to the touch, right? It's really nice, isn't it? And Kashyapa immediately said, as you said, Buddha, this robe is really soft. So Buddha, please accept this robe. When he said to the Buddha, please accept it, then what the Buddha said was, now the Buddha's outer robe was made out of like burlap, and it was also made out of burlap rags, rags that had been left along the road, thrown away among the trash and filth, and he'd made his robe out of those. And he said, "I'm wearing is this robe, a robe made of discarded rags that's made out of trash. Do you think you can wear this? If you can." And the Kashyapa said, if the Buddha can accept my robe out of your loving mind, then I will be able to wear your robe that's made out of discarded rags. So it's like they made a deal. And Buddha accepted Kashyapa's robe of fine cloth, and the Buddha, with his own hands, gave his own robe of discarded rags. And this robe that's made out of really, this not at all good quality fabric. He gave this Dharma robe that was made out of such poor material to Kashyapa. So Kashyapa wore that robe. And he would go to beg for alms every day. And 8 days after he received the Buddha's outer robe, he'd go for alms every day. What was going on? The 8th day, on the 9th day. So after 8 or 9 days, he achieved the state of arhatship. He had very high realizations, and so he achieved the state of arhatship. So it was only 8 or 9 days after the Buddha had given him the outer robe that he achieved the state of arhatship. In any case, so there was that exchange of robes between Buddha and Kashyapa. And if you think about it in terms of Kashyapa, this is really very special. The reason for this is there wasn't any other disciple of the Buddha who had such a great fortune. None of the Buddha's other disciples had such a good fortune as to be able to exchange the robes with the Buddha. So when the Buddha gave Kashyapa this robe that was made out of discarded rags that he'd found in the trash and the discarded robes, this was really a great inspiration for Kashyapa to live by the 12 qualities of training. Now, when you talk about these qualities of training, generally after the Buddha had awakened to Buddhahood, he saw that there was no point to doing as the non-Buddhists did and only dwelling in asceticism. It's too much suffering. There's no point. There was no reason to this. And so he prohibited remaining just in ascetics and being too extreme. But he also said that there are also ascetic practices that were not too severe, and he didn't prohibit those. The direction the Buddha gave the members of his Sangha is that the life of the monastic should not fall to either extreme, should not be too bad, nor should it be too luxurious. It should be right in the middle, dwelling on the middle path. We're saying that you have to stay on the middle way. This means that you're not in a lifestyle that's too easy and too careful. You have to be able to stay alone. You have to be content with meager food. So if you only get poor, meager food, you have to be okay with that. And so the middle way doesn't mean that you're staying, enjoying yourself, and getting fat. And so the Buddha had had quite a few students who had really very content, and they had very few desires. And the Buddha really praised them very highly. So when he praised them, among all of the people who abided by these qualities of trainings, the most well-known of them was Mahakashapa. Now, the reason why Mahakashapa was so well known for abiding by the 12 qualities is that he stayed in remote places. When we say the word for monastery in Tibetan, the word gumpa actually refers to like a remote place. So when you talk about a monastery or a gumpa in Tibetan, then we mean a really remote place in some forest or some very far away place, and being happy with that. And he also only lived off of alms. And when there are invitations for the Sangha to go to great meals, he never went to such places. So I thought that it'd be best now to give an explanation of these 12 qualities of training. Now, when we talk about the qualities of training, when we talk about these qualities, a duta of training, you can either count them as 12 or as 13. There are two ways to count them. In the grammar in 2 volumes that was compiled during the time of the Tibetan emperors, when they explained this word duta that we translate as qualities, the meaning of it is because when you train in them, it increases your qualities further and further. They're called qualities of training. Now, there are different ways of describing these 12 different ways to explain them. But this is here I'll explain them according to the Yogacara levels by Master Asanga. So some people say that this was written by a Sangha, some people that it was compiled by a Sangha, but in any case, and this is what we also call the 5 levels, or we can call the Bodhisattva, the Yogacara levels. In any case, there is a text in there called the Shravaka levels, and I will explain it according to this text. Now, if we divide it into different sections, there are 3 different sections. The first is the 3 regarding food. And the first of these is living on alms. Now, the 3 in terms of regarding food. The first is living on alms. So when you divide this into, you can divide it into 2, and there are 2. If you want to count the qualities of trainings as 13, then you would divide living on alms into 2. The first is being alms that are allowable from being received. And so this means that whatever household you come to on your way, you eat whatever food you receive from that household, and don't try to get any from others. This is called alms that are allowable from being received. Then there are alms received gradually. The second type, alms received gradually, means going to the door of each house and then eating whatever alms you receive. And you don't instead think of, I'm going to get better or more food at that household and go there. If you do that, that wouldn't be proper. In any case, not going and acting like this. And this is called alms received gradually. Oh. Now, the second of the 3 according to the food is the single meal. The single meal, or the single seat, you could say. This is very easy to say. Basically means you have 1 meal a day, and the reason it's called 1 seat, when you say it's a single seat, you sit on 1 seat and you eat as much as you can on that seat, and once you have gotten up from it, then you do not eat any food at all. So this is called the single seat. And there are many people who used to practice this. Then the next one is not accepting more food. So you eat whatever food you've received, you eat however much you get from your alms originally. And if you're then allowed to put more, if more is put in your food, then you don't eat that. So you have a limit to the food. And so in order that food not be wasted, they would hold this practice. So those were the 3 in terms of food. And then there are 3 regarding robes. The first is the 3 Dharma robes. So at that time, some bhikshus had the outer robe, inner robe, and the lower robe. And they didn't have any other clothing at all. They didn't keep any other clothing at all. They had none of the minor clothings. They had no extra clothing at all. And so that is the practice that they lived. And so these are called the 3 robes. And then there is a wearing felt. And so if you have the 3 robes, or if you take even one, they would all be made out of wool. And it's like a felt, actually. So now in Tibet, when we talk about felt, we make blankets out of it, but it's kind of, it's not a very soft fabric. It's a kind of like a rough fabric, right? So that's sort of fabric that it'd be made of. And so it'd be made of mail and a very rough wool fabric. And so they wouldn't accept any other robes than that, and that was called wearing felt. And the third is wearing rags. And so rags mean basically in trash. And it's taking their rags or fabric that people have discarded along the way. Some of them were covered with, you would be able to get some fabric that was made filthy by feces or urine and so forth. You'd gather them all up, the ones that were not made unclean, but you'd wash them and sew them and dye them into an appropriate color. Since bhikshus couldn't wear any color at all, you dye it into a color that's appropriate for bhikshus. And so this is what we call wearing rags. Then there are six with regard to lodging, some basic place they're staying. So there's six different practices for the way they stay. And the first of this is living in the wilderness. It's as I said before, it's staying in wilderness or forests that are remote from towns and villages. So a wilderness or a gumpa means a place that's far away from the house. So they're not near a town or a village, they're far away from them. And so they're the alms who live in these places, or they were the bhikshus who lived in the center of jungles or forests. There were some bhikshus like this, and they were called said to live in the forests, live in the wilderness. Then they were living by trees. This meant that instead of staying in a building, you'd stay underneath the horse. If you're going to rain, if you're sitting under the tree, it protects you, right? So they stayed permanently under trees. There are some who stayed. They were called tree dwellers, and then there's also roofless dwellers. And so it means staying in places where there is no roof or place where you're covered by a roof. It means sitting outside, not inside a house, not covered by a roof. And so there are people who practiced this too. Then there were charnel grounds. This is easy to understand, right? So a charnel ground is where people would dispose of corpses, and there would be the monks who stayed there to do their practice. And then there are the sitters. So they'd have like a seat or a low seat. They had like some sort of a seat or if when they're building, when they would they'd spread out their grass underneath a tree, and but they wouldn't lean back at all. Normally, when we lie down, we lie down with our side on the ground, but they wouldn't lie down like that. They would always remain sitting up. So they're called the sitters. So in our Karmakaju, when we do the 3-year retreat, you're not allowed to lie down, right? In our Karma Constant tradition, you have to stay seated the whole time. We have that tradition as well. And so this is what we call the practice of the sitters. And there are the people who take the seat as it is. You would spread out grass and leaves as your seat, but you would not use any fabric or robe or clothing. And once you have arranged it the first time, however it ended up being as it was, you just sit on it. You don't ever add any more grass or exchange the grass or trying to rearrange it. You just sit on it as it originally was laid out, and just continued sitting there. Because they're seats, they just always sit on the same seat. So however the leaves or grass were laid out, they just continued sitting on that. So that's another sort of practice. So these are the 12 qualities of training. And so in the old time, among Buddhists, the Buddha didn't like it when people continually practiced only desires, asceticism like the non-Buddhists. But he did praise practicing in ways that accorded with the Dharma. So during the time of the Buddha, there were many bhikshus who engaged in ascetics that accorded with the Dharma, and one representative of these, the most well-known representative, is Mahakashapa. Now, when I speak about these 12 qualities of trainings, these 12 or 13 qualities of transit, is there something that one person practices all 12 of them? This is not the case. And the reason is you can't really do it because some of them you can't do them at the same time. So some people would be living on alms. Someone would practice 2 or 3 of the 12 qualities. Someone live by one of the 12 qualities. There are various different levels. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone abides by 12 of these qualities of training. So for that reason, today, in connection with Mahakashapa's life's liberation story, I've explained these 12 qualities of training as they were, I've explained them as they're described in the ancient texts from the time of the original texts of original Buddhism. So that is enough for today. And so then after that, we'll speak about the story of Ananda, and then eventually we'll get to the first council. So thank you very much.